The ball was only just beginning as Kitty and her mother walked up the great staircase, flooded with light and lined with flowers and footmen in powder and red coats. From the rooms came a constant steady hum, as from a hive, and the rustle of movement, and while on the landing between the levels they gave last touches to their hair and dresses before the mirror, they heard from the ballroom the careful distinct notes of the fiddles of the orchestra beginning the first waltz. A little old man in civilian dress, arranging his gray curls before another mirror and diffusing an odor of scent, stumbled against them on the stairs and stood aside, evidently admiring Kitty, whom he did not know. A beardless youth, one of those society youths whom the old Prince Shtcherbatsky called young bucks, in an exceedingly open waistcoat, straightening his white tie as he went, bowed to them, and, after running by, came back to ask Kitty for a quadrille. As the first quadrille had already been given to Vronsky, she had to promise this youth the second. An officer, buttoning his glove, stood aside in the doorway and, stroking his mustache, admired rosy Kitty. Although her dress, her hair, and all the preparations for the ball had cost Kitty great trouble and consideration, at this moment she walked into the ballroom in her elaborate tulle dress over a pink slip as easily and simply as though all the rosettes and lace, all the last-minute details of her attire, had not cost her or her family a moment's attention, as though she had been born in that tulle and lace, with her hair done up high on her head, and a rose and 2 leaves on the top of it. When, just before entering the ballroom, the princess, her mother, tried to turn right side out of the ribbon of her sash, Kitty had drawn back a little. She felt that everything must be right of itself, and graceful, and nothing could need setting straight. It was one of Kitty's best days. Her dress was not uncomfortable anywhere. Her lace did not droop anywhere. Her rosettes were not crushed nor torn off. Her pink slippers with high hollowed-out heels did not pinch, but gladdened her feet, and the thick rolls of fair chignon kept up on her head as if they were her own hair. All the 3 buttons buttoned up without tearing on the long glove that covered her hand without concealing its lines. The black velvet of her locket nestled with special softness around her neck. That velvet was delicious. At home, looking at her neck in the looking-glass, Kitty had felt that that velvet was speaking. About all the rest there might be a doubt, but the velvet was delicious. Kitty smiled here, too, at the ball when she glanced at it in the glass. Her bare shoulders and arms gave Kitty a sense of chill marble, a feeling she particularly liked. Her eyes sparkled, and her rosy lips could not keep from smiling from the consciousness of her own attractiveness. She had scarcely entered the ballroom and reached the throng of ladies, all tulle, ribbons, lace, and flowers, waiting to be asked to dance. Kitty was never one of that throng. When she was asked for a waltz, and asked by the best partner, the first star in the hierarchy of the ballroom, a renowned director of dances, a married man, handsome and well-built, Yegorushka Korsunsky. He had only just left the Countess Bonina, with whom he had danced the first half of the waltz, and scanning his kingdom, that is to say, a few couples who had started dancing, he caught sight of Kitty entering, and he flew up to her with that peculiar easy amble which is confined to the directors of balls. Without even asking if she cared to dance, he put out his arm to encircle her slender waist. She looked round for someone to give her fan to, and their hostess, smiling to her, took it. "How nice! You've come in good time," he said to her, embracing her waist. Such a bad habit to be late. Bending her left hand, she laid it on his shoulder, and her little feet in their pink slippers began swiftly, lightly, and rhythmically moving over the slippery floor in time to the music. "It's a rest to waltz with you," he said to her, as they fell into the first slow steps of the waltz. "It's exquisite, such lightness, precision." He said to her the same thing he said to almost all his partners whom he knew well. She smiled at his praise, and she continued to look about the room over his shoulder. She was not like a girl at her first ball, for whom all faces in the ballroom melt into one vision of fairyland, and she was not a girl who had gone the stale round of balls till every face in the ballroom was familiar and tiresome. But she was in the middle stage between these two. She was excited, and at the same time she had sufficient self-possession to be able to observe. In the left corner of the ballroom she saw the cream of society gathered together. There, incredibly naked, was the beauty of Lady, Kerensky's wife. There was the lady of the house. There shone the bald head of Levin, always to be found where the best people were. In that direction gazed the young men, not venturing to approach. There, too, she descried Stiva, and there she saw the exquisite figure and head of Anna in a black velvet gown. And he was there. Kitty had not seen him since the evening she refused Levin. With her long-sighted eyes she knew him at once, and was even aware that he was looking at her. "Another turn? You're not tired?" said Kerensky, a little out of breath. "No, thank you." "Where shall I take you?" "Madame Karenina's here, I think. Take me to her." "Wherever you command." And Kerensky began waltzing with measured steps straight towards the group in the left corner, continually saying "Pardon, pardon," and steering his course through the sea of lace, tulle, and ribbon, and not disarranging a feather. He turned his partner sharply round, so that her slim ankles and light transparent stockings were exposed to view, and her train floated out in fan shape and covered Levin's knees. Kerensky bowed, set straight his open shirt front, and gave her his arm to conduct her to Anna Arkadyevna. Kitty, flushed, took her train from Levin's knees, and a little giddy looked round, seeking Anna. Anna was not in lilac, as Kitty had so urgently wished, but in a black low-cut velvet gown, showing her full throat and shoulders, that looked as though carved in old ivory, and her rounded arms with tiny, slender wrists. The whole gown was trimmed with Venetian guipure. On her head, among her black hair, her own, with no false additions, was a little wreath of pansies, and a bouquet of the same in the black ribbon of her sash among white lace. Her coiffure was not striking. All that was noticeable was the little wilful tendrils of her curly black hair that would always break free about her neck and temples. Round her well-cut strong neck was a thread of pearls. Kitty had been seeing Anna every day. She adored her, and had pictured her invariably in lilac. But now, seeing her in black, she felt that she had not fully seen her charm. She saw her now as someone quite new and surprising to her. Now she understood that Anna could not have been in lilac, and that her charm was just that she always stood out against her attire, that her dress could never be noticeable on her. And her black dress, with its sumptuous lace, was not noticeable on her. It was only the frame, and all that was seen was she, simple, natural, elegant, and at the same time gay and eager. She was standing holding herself, as always, very erect, and when Kitty drew near the group she was speaking to the master of the house, her head slightly turned towards him. "No, I don't throw stones," she was saying, in answer to something, "though I can't understand it," she went on, shrugging her shoulders, and she turned at once with a soft smile of protection towards Kitty. With a flying feminine glance she scanned her attire and made a movement of her head, hardly perceptible, but understood by Kitty, signifying approval of her dress and her looks. "You came into the room dancing," she added. "This is one of my most faithful supporters," said Kerensky, bowing to Anna Arkadyevna, whom he had not yet seen. "The princess helps to make balls happy and successful. Anna Arkadyevna, a waltz," he said, bending down to her. "Why, Have you met? Inquired their host. Is there anyone we have not met? My wife and I are like white wolves. Everyone knows us, answered Korsunsky. A waltz, Anna Arkadyevna? I don't dance when it's possible not to dance, she said. But tonight it is impossible, answered Korsunsky. At that instant, Vronsky came up. Well, since it is impossible tonight, let us start, she said, not noticing Vronsky's bow, and she hastily put her hand on Korsunsky's shoulder. What is she vexed with him about? Thought Kitty, discerning that Anna had intentionally not responded to Vronsky's bow. Vronsky went up to Kitty, reminding her of the first quadrille and expressing his regret that he had not seen her all this time. Kitty gazed in admiration at Anna waltzing and listened to him. She expected him to ask her for a waltz, but he did not, and she glanced wonderingly at him. He flushed slightly and hurriedly asked her to waltz, but he had only just put his arm around her waist and taken the first step when the music suddenly stopped. Kitty looked into his face, which was so close to her own, and long afterwards, for several years afterwards, that look, full of love, to which he made no response, cut her to the heart with an agony of shame. Pardon, pardon, waltz, waltz, shouted Korsunsky from the other side of the room, and seizing the first young lady he came across, he began dancing himself. Vronsky and Kitty waltzed several times round the room. After the first waltz, Kitty went to her mother, and she hardly had time to say a few words to Countess Nordstrom when Vronsky came up again for the first quadrille. During the quadrille, nothing of any significance was said. There was disjointed talk between them of the Korsunskys, husband and wife, whom he described very amusingly as delightful children at 40, and of the future town theater, and only once the conversation touched her to the quick, when he asked her about Levin, whether he was here, and added that he liked him so much. But Kitty did not expect much from the quadrille. She looked forward with a thrill in her heart to the mazurka. She fancied that in that dance everything must be decided. The fact that he did not, during the quadrille, ask her for the mazurka did not trouble her. She felt sure she would dance the mazurka with him, as she had done at former balls, and refused 5 young men, saying she was engaged for the mazurka. The whole ball up to the last quadrille was for Kitty an enchanted vision of delightful colors, sounds, and motions. She only sat down when she felt too tired and begged for a rest. But as she was dancing the last quadrille with one of the tiresome young men whom she could not refuse, she chanced to be vis-a-vis with Vronsky and Anna. She had not been near Anna again since the beginning of the evening, and now again she saw her suddenly quite new and surprising. She saw in her the signs of that excitement of success she knew so well in herself. She saw that she was intoxicated with the delighted admiration she was exciting. She knew that feeling and knew its signs, and saw them in Anna, saw the quivering, flashing light in her eyes, and the smile of happiness and excitement unconsciously playing on her lips, and the deliberate grace, precision, and lightness of her movements. Who, she asked herself, all or one? And not assisting the harassed young man she was dancing with in the conversation, the thread of which she had lost and could not pick up again, she obeyed with external liveliness the peremptory shouts of Korsunsky, starting them all into the grand rond, and then into the Schein, and at the same time she kept watch with a growing pang in her heart. No, it's not the admiration of the crowd that's intoxicated her, but the adoration of one. And that one, can it be he? Every time he spoke to Anna, the joyous light flashed into her eyes, and the smile of happiness curved her red lips. To try to not show these signs of delight but they came out on her face of themselves. But what of him? Kitty looked at him and was filled with terror. What was pictured so clearly to Kitty in the mirror of Anna's face, she saw in him. What had become of his always self-possessed, resolute manner, and the carelessly serene expression of his face? Now, every time he turned to her, he bent his head, as though he would have fallen at her feet, and in his eyes there was nothing but humble submission and dread. "I would not offend you," his eyes seemed every time to be saying, "but I want to save myself, and I don't know how." On his face was a look such as Kitty had never seen before. They were speaking of common acquaintances, keeping up the most trivial conversation, but to Kitty it seemed that every word they said was determining their fate and hers. And strange it was that they were actually talking of how absurd Ivan Ivanovitch was with his French, and how the Ilitsky girl might have made a better match. Yet these words had all the while consequence for them, and they were feeling just as Kitty did. The whole ball, the whole world, everything seemed lost in fog in Kitty's soul. Nothing but the stern discipline of her bringing up supported her and forced her to do what was expected of her, that is, to dance, to answer questions, to talk, even to smile. But before the mazurka, when they were beginning to rearrange the chairs and a few couples moved out of the smaller rooms into the big room, a moment of despair and horror came for Kitty. She had refused 5 partners, and now she was not dancing the mazurka. She had not even a hope of being asked for it, because she was so successful in society that the idea would never occur to anyone that she had remained disengaged till now. She would have to tell her mother she felt ill and go home, but she had not the strength to do this. She felt crushed. She went to the furthest end of the little drawing-room and sank into a low chair. Her light, transparent skirts rose like a cloud about her slender waist. One bare, thin, soft, girlish arm, hanging listlessly, was lost in the folds of her pink tunic. In the other she held her fan, and with rapid short strokes fanned her burning face. But while she looked like a butterfly, clinging to a blade of grass, and just about to open its wings for fresh flight, her heart ached with a horrible despair. But perhaps I am wrong. Perhaps it was not so. And again she recalled all she had seen. "Kitty, what is it?" said Countess Nordston, stepping noiselessly over the carpet towards her. "I don't understand it." Kitty's lower lip began to quiver. She got up quickly. "Kitty, you're not dancing in the mazurka?" No, said Kitty, in a voice shaking with tears. "He asked her for the mazurka before me," said Countess Nordston, knowing Kitty would understand who were he and her. "She said, 'Why, aren't you going to dance it with the Princess Shtcherbatskaya?'" "Oh, I don't care," answered Kitty. No one but she herself understood her position. No one knew that she had just refused the man whom perhaps she loved, and refused him because she had put her faith in another. Countess Nordston found Korsunsky, with whom she was to dance the mazurka, and told him to ask Kitty. Kitty danced in the first couple, and luckily for her she had not to talk, because Korsunsky was all the time running about directing the figure. Vronsky and Anna sat almost opposite her. She saw them with her long-sighted eyes, and saw them, too, close by when they met in the figures, and the more she saw of them, the more convinced she was that her unhappiness was complete. She saw that they felt themselves alone in that crowded room, and on Vronsky's face, always so firm and independent, she saw that look that had struck her, of bewilderment and humble submissiveness, like the expression of an intelligent dog when it has done wrong. Anna smiled, and her smile was reflected by him. She grew thoughtful, and he became serious. Some supernatural force drew Kitty's eyes to Anna's face. She was fascinating in her simple black dress. Fascinating were her round arms with their bracelets. Fascinating was her firm neck with its thread of pearls. Fascinating the straying curls of her loose hair. Fascinating the graceful light movements of her little feet and hands. Fascinating was that lovely face and its eagerness. But there was something terrible and cruel in her fascination. Kitty admired her more than ever, and more acute was her suffering. Kitty felt overwhelmed, and her face showed it. When Vronsky saw her coming across her in the mazurka, he did not at once recognize her, she was so changed. "Delightful ball," he said to her, for the sake of saying something. "Yes," she answered. In the middle of the mazurka, repeating a complicated figure newly invented by Korsunsky, Anna came forward into the center of the circle, chose 2 gentlemen, and summoned a lady and Kitty. Kitty gazed at her in dismay as she went up. Anna looked at her with drooping eyelids and smiled, pressing her hands. But, noticing that Kitty only responded to her smile by a look of despair and amazement, she turned away from her and began gaily talking to the other lady. "Yes, there is something uncanny, devilish, and fascinating in her," Kitty said to herself. Anna did not mean to stay to supper, but the master of the house began to press her to do so. "Nonsense, Anna Arkadyevna," said Korsunsky, drawing her bare arm under the sleeve of his dress coat. "I've such an idea for a cotillion, un bijou." And he moved gradually on, trying to draw her along with him. Their host smiled approvingly. "No, I am not going to stay," answered Anna, smiling. But in spite of her smile, both Korsunsky and the master of the house saw from her resolute tone that she would not stay. "No, why, as it is, I have danced more at your ball in Moscow than I have all the winter in Petersburg," said Anna, looking round at Vronsky, who stood near her. "I must rest a little before my journey." "Are you certainly going tomorrow, then?" asked Vronsky. "Yes, I suppose so," answered Anna, as it were wondering at the boldness of his question. But the irrepressible quivering brilliance of her eyes and her smile set him on fire as she said it. Anna Arkadyevna did not stay to supper, but went home. "Yes, there is something in me hateful, repulsive," thought Levin as he came around from the Shtcherbatskys and walked in the direction of his brother's lodgings. "And I don't get on with other people. Pride, they say. No, I have no pride. If I had any pride, I should not have put myself in such a position." And he pictured to himself Vronsky, happy, good-natured, clever, and self-possessed, certainly never placed in the awful position in which he had been that evening. Yes, she was bound to choose him. So it had to be, and I cannot complain of anyone or anything. I am myself to blame. What right had I to imagine she would care to join her life to mine? Who am I, and what am I? A nobody, not wanted by anyone, nor of any use to anybody. And he recalled his brother Nikolay, and dwelt with pleasure on the thought of him. Isn't he right that everything in the world is base and loathsome? Are we fair in our judgment of brother Nikolay? Of course, from one point of view, seeing him in a torn cloak and tipsy, he's a despicable person. But I know him differently. I know his soul, and I know that we are like him. And I, instead of going to seek him out, went out to dinner and came here. Levin walked up to a lamp-post, read his brother's address, which was in his pocket-book, and called a sledge. All the long way to his brother's, Levin vividly recalled all the facts familiar to him of his brother Nikolay's life. He remembered how his brother, while at the university, and for a year afterwards, had, in spite of the jeers of his companions, lived like a monk, strictly observing all religious rites, services, and fast, and avoiding every sort of pleasure, especially women. And afterwards, how he had all at once broken out. He had associated with the most horrible people, and rushed into the most senseless debauchery. He remembered later the scandal over a boy, whom he had taken from the country to bring up, and, in a fit of rage, had so violently beaten that proceedings were brought against him for unlawfully wounding. Then he recalled the scandal with a sharper, to whom he had lost money and given a promissory note, and against whom he had himself lodged a complaint, asserting that he had cheated him. This was the money Sergei Ivanovitch had paid. Then he remembered how he had spent a night in the lockup for disorderly conduct in the street. He remembered the shameful proceedings he had tried to get up against his brother Sergei Ivanovitch, accusing him of not having paid him his share of his mother's fortune, and the last scandal, when he had gone to a western province in an official capacity, and there had got into trouble for assaulting a village elder. It was all horribly disgusting. Yet to Levin it appeared not at all in the same disgusting light as it inevitably would to those who did not know Nikolay, did not know all his story, did not know his heart. Levin remembered that when Nikolay had been in the devout stage, the period of fast and monks and church services, when he was seeking in religion a support and a curb for his passionate temperament, everyone, far from encouraging him, had jeered at him, and he, too, with the others. They had teased him, called him Noah and monk, and, when he had broken out, no one had helped him, but everyone had turned away from him with horror and disgust. Levin felt that, in spite of all the ugliness of his life, his brother Nikolay, in his soul, in the very depths of his soul, was no more in the wrong than the people who despised him. He was not to blame for having been born with his unbridled temperament and his somehow limited intelligence, but he had always wanted to be good. I will tell him everything without reserve, and I will make him speak without reserve too, and I'll show him that I love him and so understand him, Levin resolved to himself as, towards 11 o'clock, he reached the hotel of which he had the address. At the top, 12 and 13, the porter answered Levin's inquiry. At home? Sure to be at home. The door of number 12 was half open, and there came out into the streak of light thick fumes of cheap, poor tobacco, and the sound of a voice unknown to Levin, but he knew at once that his brother was there. He heard his cough. As he went in the door, the unknown voice was saying, "It all depends with how much judgment and knowledge the thing's done." Konstantin Levin looked in at the door and saw that the speaker was a young man with an immense shock of hair, wearing a Russian jerkin, and that a pock-marked woman in a woolen gown without collar or cuffs was sitting on the sofa. His brother was not to be seen. Konstantin felt a sharp pang at his heart at the thought of the strange company in which his brother spent his life. No one heard him, and Konstantin, taking off his galoshes, listened to what the gentleman in the jerkin was saying. He was speaking of some enterprise. "Well, the devil flay them, the privileged classes," his brother's voice responded with a cough. "Masha, get us some supper and some wine, if there's any left, or else go and get some." The woman rose and came out from behind the screen and saw Konstantin. "There's some gentleman, Nikolay Dmitrievich," she said. "Whom do you want?" said the voice of Nikolay Levin angrily. "It's I," answered Konstantin Levin, coming forward into the light. He could be heard getting up hurriedly, stumbling against something, and Levin saw, facing him in the doorway, the big scared eyes and the huge, thin, stooping figure of his brother, so familiar, and yet astonishing in its weirdness and sickliness. He was even thinner than 3 years before, when Konstantin Levin had seen him last. He was wearing a short coat, and his hands and big bones seemed huger than ever. His hair had grown thinner. The same straight mustaches hid his lips. The same eyes gazed strangely and naively at his visitor. "Ah, Kostya!" he exclaimed suddenly, recognizing his brother, and his eyes lit up with joy. But the same second he looked round at the young man, and gave the nervous jerk of his head and neck that Konstantin knew so well, as if his neckband hurt him, and a quite different expression, wild, suffering, and cruel, rested on his emaciated face. "I wrote to you and Sergei Ivanovitch both that I don't know you and don't want to know you. What is it you want?" He was not at all the same as Konstantin had been fancying him. The worst and most tiresome part of his character, what made all relations with him so difficult, had been forgotten by Konstantin Levin when he thought of him, and now, when he saw his face, and especially that nervous twitching of his head, he remembered it all. "I didn't want to see you for anything," he answered timidly. "I've simply come to see you." His brother's timidity obviously softened Nikolay. His lips twitched. "Oh, so that's it," he said. "Well, come in, sit down. Like some supper? Masha, bring supper for 3. No, stop a minute. Do you know who this is?" he said, addressing his brother, and indicating the gentleman in the jerkin. "This is Mr. Kritsky, my friend from Kiev, a very remarkable man. He's persecuted by the police, of course, because he's not a scoundrel." And he looked round in the way he always did at everyone in the room. Seeing that the woman standing in the doorway was moving to go, he shouted to her, "Wait a minute, I said." And with the inability to express himself, the incoherence that Konstantin knew so well, he began, with another look round at everyone, to tell his brother Kritsky's story, how he had been expelled from the university for starting a benefit society for the poor students in Sunday schools, and how he had afterwards been a teacher in a peasant school, and how he had been driven out of that too, and had afterwards been condemned for something. "You're of the Kiev University?" said Konstantin Levin to Kritsky, to break the awkward silence that followed. "Yes, I was of Kiev," Kritsky replied angrily, his face darkening. "And this woman," Nikolay Levin interrupted him, pointing to her, "is the partner of my life, Marya Nikolaevna. I took her out of a bad house," and he jerked his neck saying this, "but I love her and respect her. And anyone who wants to know me," he added, raising his voice and knitting his brows, "I beg to love and respect her. She's just the same as my wife, just the same. So now you know whom you've got to do with. And if you think you're lowering yourself, well, here's the floor, there's the door." And again his eyes traveled inquiringly over all of them. "Why I should be lowering myself, I don't understand." "Then, Masha, tell them to bring supper. 3 portions, spirits and wine. No, wait a minute. No, it doesn't matter. Go along."